Hey, hello, welcome to Garden Chronicles. My name is James David. In this particular video, I'll be talking a lot of information concerning terrariums. Now, I would like to say that I've actually had about 3 years of failures trying to cultivate my terrariums, and finally, I found a secret ingredients on how to keep them successful for many years. And this particular video is basically more on the element of keeping the terrarium in a tropical garden. Now, one of the things that I've noticed is that after observing so many videos and YouTube channel and checking it through and a lot of trials and error, somehow I find that when it comes to tropical environment, especially the climate zone, it doesn't really appears to be applicable for every single region. Like in most cases, the terrariums that I've actually noticed that is been cultivated in temperate region does not have the same elements and values when it comes to the tropical region. Hence a lot of trials and errors, and I found this style and on a way to say the tips and tricks and sort of all the information that I'll try my best to put it here in this particular video. Do watch out for my part 2, part 3 and more of the thoughts and tips on how I care for them this particular video. These terrariums are actually 1 week old, and therefore I want to show to you my step-by-step on a tutorial based on how I started first and all the way through for this particular result. So sit back and enjoy the show. First thing first, before doing anything, is to select the type of containers. This particular one is I found it's supposed to be a biscuit container, and you can actually buy it online, or you can actually check it out in a DIY shops. I'm actually located in Malaysia, and normally we can actually get it around Southeast Asia regions. Do look out for this particular type of product. Normally this actually shipped around from China, and you can actually get it in bulk, and it's very cost effective. Now, one of the most important thing I would like to share to you here is that this is sort of the smallest container that I've come across. Do not go much more smaller than this, because it will sort of like defeats its purpose, because the element that is required is that if it's too small, that by the time you put the drainage material and plus the substrate and the plants, the whole thing will be compact. So I'll suggest not to get much more smaller than this. Another factor that I want to mention to you is that when it comes to tropical region, I would strongly suggest to get a plastic material, and somehow I find it's durable, just in case accidentally if you were to drop it, it will not shatter to pieces. And that durability in such a sense, I think this is very much practical and also cheap, as if you want to try it in element where it's a lot of more on a beginner's kind of thing. I would really recommend to use a plastic material. These are the materials that I'm actually using for my terrarium setup. Nothing fancy, very practical and easy to use. One of the most important things that I would always want to overemphasize is to always sterile and keep the scissors clean. And also when it comes to like materials like chopsticks, these are the ones more on the element where it is disposable chopsticks. So do always use a clean one. As for the materials for the terrarium, the most important thing is sort of like a barrier between the drainage material from the substrate. This particular one is actually a cotton fiber. Especially I actually using the aquarium fish filter, the one that you use for the aquarium. Of course, you can actually use for any other synthetic cotton fibers are the best. I would not recommend to use anything organic, especially some of the people that I've known have actually tried to use coconut coir or coconut fiber or even sphagnum moss. I find that in due time these things deteriorate and sort of like floods into the drainage kind of a barrier, where I find that when there is no barrier in between water and the substrate, the whole thing can considered as a failure where there is no water retention. So I'll suggest to use something which is durable and long term. Finally, the next most important material that I use is the drainage material. This particular one, I'm actually using leca. Of course, there's so many other drainage materials you can actually use. You can also use pebbles, marbles. Also, you can also use charcoal, something that is durable and long term, but not too big and not too small. So let's get started and get into the fun factor. These are the containers that I have actually selected and I have placed in the lacquer balls here. Now do take note the layer of a lacquer ball. It is sort of like at least a pebble size length or maybe two, but do not sort of like make it too thin because you really need that space for the water retention to take place. I always suggest or would really recommend to create something like a slope kind of an effect because that will actually help the water to sort of like descend carefully. And this is one of the most important things because if it gets flooded, it is going to be very difficult to drain out the whole thing out, and then some of the substrate of the plant might just fall out accidentally while draining out the water. So do take note to always create something like a slope kind of a system in such a way that that will also create a beautiful feature when it comes to the final product. The next material is the cotton fiber. Here if you notice I've actually sliced it and I also sort of like pull out into layers so that it will actually hold more base factor to become a barrier between the lacquer balls and the substrate that I'm planning to put in. Now, as I mentioned earlier, it is important that these have to be very well placed, that in any mistake that has taken place, it is too late to rectify it unless you have to like take out the whole thing and redo all over again. So the best element here is to be safe and sorry, to in a way to put as much layers as possible, but you don't really have to be too much about it. And in worst case to come to worst case scenario, if in case the substrate were to collapse and fall at the bottom of the drainage material, I think in a way the plant or the terrarium will fix its own system naturally. I have seen some videos where they actually use mesh netting or something that is very much like a strainer kind of material. Do take note that if it's too big a kind of a hole in between, then it defeats the purpose where a lot of the materials that substrate might actually fall in between and actually floods the drainage material. So do take note of it, that try to get something that it is water resistant, such a way that it acts as a filter that water can actually go through it, but it holds back the substrate that is above it, especially soil, sand, or whatever substrate that you're planning to put on. As I mentioned earlier, do not use anything that is organic, such as a natural cotton or sphagnum moss or even coconut fiber for this stage. Now the next stage is adding the substrate. Here I'm actually using vermicompost as a kind of a first layer of substrate. Now one of the other most important thing that I want to mention here is that not to use too much of strong base kind of material like some of the people that I've used, or even I want to mention is that in the past that I've actually used very rich compost, and it actually have a reverse effect where the plants that is being grown in a terrarium overgrew the terrarium too fast too soon, and also in worst case scenario that it actually creates fungus and unnecessary problem because it is not meant to be in a long-term basis in a terrarium. So I would actually recommend to use something which is very lightly. If you're using compost, is great, but use very lightly and very sparingly. Also try to avoid using strong fertilizer, and especially long-term kind of a slow release fertilizers, as these are actually sort of like submerged long term in a water-based kind of material can have a reverse effect in this terrarium. Now, coming to my main special ingredient, or would I rather say the main ingredient which I would like to share here, is actually river sand or any type of sand. I would rather use this because I find that this particular material seems to be sort of like an absorbent and a kind of a conduit in a way to say that is good for drainage, at the same time moisture retention. I would not recommend to use a kind of a compost based or rich based soil material, in a way to say that some terrarium experts would actually recommend to use a mixture of pine bark together with sphagnum moss and compost in a kind of that kind of a mix, which I find that it is not good for this kind of setup for the tropical climate. Now, again, it is a contention, and I have actually tried this many times, also in a glass setting, and the whole thing messes up the whole equilibrium or sort of like an ecology in a terrarium. Unless perhaps if I were to mix it and just leave it as it is, it will sort of like create a new plant material kind of stuff coming from that, a new growth, but it will not be the original setup. And I find the sand somehow create a kind of sterile system, and it is actually a very strong deterrent to fungus. And most, or you must say 90% of my terrarium failure is because of fungus attack. And for some strange reason, it always comes because of rich compost material. In most cases, is either organic or inorganic materials, which is too rich, and the plant may not able to absorb a lot of this to convert it into a kind of a natural equilibrium, and therefore the fungus attacks takes place strongly because of rich moisture retention kind of a equilibrium. Now, coming back to the setup, if you notice here that I'm actually using as minimum as possible, and they are all in a slope kind of a base system. Now, one of the things that I want to make a big emphasis here is minimize on this. At least like a 30% of this whole setup is just for this system. That means to say from the drainage hole together with the cotton fiber with the sand in a slope based kind of system. Do compress it very well so that the whole thing is sort of like pressed in, and the whole thing should be within sort of like 30% or slightly 20% of the whole side of the terrarium. Now the next set of it will be plant-based material. Now, and also you need to have a little bit of a space in between the plants and the terrarium, roughly another 10 to 20% of it. So you must able to see that it is supposed to be like 30%, 30%, 30% ratio. Now, if it is 50% ratio, then the plant material may not be enough, such a way that if the plant material may take about 10%, 20%, then you only have 10% of the air movement on it, and the whole thing can be overwhelmed. So try to compact it as much as possible. As I mentioned to you, this is the smallest terrarium that I've actually able to set in according to this measure. Another most important thing that I want to make mention is that do it as patient as possible. I find that if you're rushing for time or something like that, then do it portion by portion. And I would rather say that this is something like a 50% of it. Do take your time and enjoy going through the process, because if you rush into it, you may make a small mistake and the whole thing can collapse, and it can create an irritation because it's not according to what you want. However, based on my experience, I always look at it as a fun factor kind of thing and more on experimental value. So I will know roughly what works and what doesn't. And in a way to say it's more of a process rather than a final destination. Now, coming to the most important and the fun part is introduction of the plant material for this terrarium. I'm here now introducing Pellonia Repens as the main feature for this terrarium. And I find that categorized in a factor of hardiness, I find this is one of the best ones. And through my experience, I find that Pellonia Repens seems to be the most hardiest and never dies in a terrarium setup. So I find that in comparison with so many other types of plants, I would really recommend this as a beginner's terrarium successful plant material to be introduced in a terrarium setup. I have actually covered a very detailed information on this plant material in my earlier videos. Do check out on that introduction of it as I put it over here for you to check through. I will also put in the link for you to click on it in my comment section. Here we notice I'm actually using 2-node plant cuttings without roots for this terrarium setup. One of the things that I've noticed is not to press in the plant material without using a chopsticks. Here I'm actually using a chopstick as a poking material, and then I'm placing in the stem cutting into the substrate. Now this is very important because there was the element here that I have actually, based on my experience, is that sometimes due to impatience I just press through the whole thing into the saw material and the stem snaps, and that causes a kind of a grievance because I have to redo the whole thing in a way that if the planting is not done properly, the cutting may rot and spoil the whole terrarium setup. So do practice patience and do caution on this to make sure that the node, especially the part where there is a kind of a divider between the leaf, make sure that that portion of it, the leaves are actually been stripped off or cut off, and place that portion of it into the substrate so that the roots may develop. And this is very important because if you were to loosely tuck in the whole thing, and if the roots do not pick up or grow, that particular cutting may rot and may contaminate the whole terrarium setup. So this is very important to watch daily, or in a way to say weekly, to figure out, to see that nothing rots or dies. In case there are certain yellowing taking place, or the cutting appears to be like limp in a week's time and not appears to be growing very well, remove that cutting immediately. I have now placed 2 to 3 cuttings in a terrarium. Actually, it's considered very full. Do not overwhelm it as or put too much of it as an end result. Leave it in such a way there is room for growth. And this is very important because if it overgrows, it's going to be actually overwhelm the whole place. So such a way, just give it at least a little bit of space, that in case it overgrows, do take note that you may have to cut it into half and remove the growth so that there is enough room for everything to appear full in this particular terrarium. Now the most fun part, or the most important part about terrarium, is the moss. What is a terrarium without a moss? You tell me. So this particular one is what I have actually collected over the month's time, and I find that they do very well in this kind of a setup. This is actually my long-term collection setup. I actually cut 2 of the soft drink bottles and actually just enclose them into it as a temporary setup. You can actually have a permanent setup, but for me this actually works best in a practical terms. What I will actually do here is that if in case I were to find any collection of mosses, and this is what I actually do, and I find that this works best in my climate zone condition. Of course, these are actually native in my region, and this is commonly known as fern moss. There are indeed many different type of moss, and they are all subject for experimenting and trial and error. Somehow I find that this particular one seems to be very much like a semi-aquatic base and does very well in a terrarium where it is really rich in high moisture base humidity factor. So it can actually does very well in a submerged element and in a way semi-aquatic system. There are some types of moss that is not suitable, which I find through my experiences. It could due to be high humidity or low humidity or lack of light, or it may be too hot or too dry. So it is all subject to trial and error. And another element that I want to mention is that after collecting it, I would normally wash it in such a way to keep it as sterile as possible. There are times that I find that other kind of insects or certain kind of bugs may be resident which can be hidden, so it's always good to be quarantined to check through whether it is good to reintroduce into a terrarium setup. And one of the things is that you want to avoid is to bring in a kind of contaminated specimen into the thing, and it can actually ruin the whole thing. So one of the things that I will actually do here is carefully wash it, like submerging into a container of water, and constantly just wash it several times until all the debris and dirt is removed. You can't actually remove 100% of it, because in doing so the whole moss is actually more of a colony based moss, can actually collapse, and you may have to collect it one by one. So do be careful not to run it on a fast running water or tap water, because it can disintegrate. So the best thing to do is carefully submerge and wash lightly, such a way that it does not lose its composition. Another factor that to be noted is that avoid using moss that is overly spent. Like if you notice there's too much of browning taking place and there's only a little bit of aging where it is only green, do not use those moss, because it is at a stage where it is actually deteriorating. Also, do not use the ones that is overly disintegrated, because it may not be viable or optimum to use as a terrarium setup. Another factor about collection of moss is that always try to collect them as big as possible, especially the clumps, because if it's too small and by the time it actually disintegrates, it is going to be tedious and it's going to take time costing and very difficult to place them in a terrarium. Do take note that when it comes to moss, they are non-root plant-based material. That means that in a sense to say that they do not have actually roots. So it's more like carpet layering kind of plant material. So you have to understand, not necessarily need to submerge them into a substrate in a way to say that poking it as expecting them to take root into the terrarium base. Now I have a favor to ask. If you like the video and you're watching it this far, I would really like you to take your time to click like in this particular video. Of course, I will really appreciate if you can subscribe if you have not subscribed yet, and also put in some comments if you find anything interesting thus far in this particular video, that you have any questions. Do put in your thoughts about it, and I will really appreciate, and I will answer each and every comments that is being posted in my best ability according to my experience. Now coming to the final product of it, after layering all this moss around the main plant, it's very much decorative, and based on your creativity and see how you feel like it, and it's more like a piece of artwork. As I said earlier, take your time and do it, because it's more of a therapeutic kind of a feel in preparing this terrarium. Now one of the things that I want to mention here is that when it comes to watering, you can actually spray on it, or you can actually let a little bit of water to get into the terrarium. Make sure that if you're using tap water, not to use the faucet in a high speed kind of thing, the whole thing will be washed off. Just a little bit of it, and let the whole water thing drained out, at least half of the size of the leca balls, or even lesser than that. Now this thing, once the water has set in and saturated, close it tight and leave it as it is. You will notice that a lot of condensation that takes place around the surface material of the terrarium. It is actually okay, as I would rather say, when it comes to tropical garden regions, because I find that other terrarium experts who often mention that if the condensation actually takes place as it appears to be like a lot, then it's actually overwatered. Yes, it is true, but however you look at it, when it comes to a hot and humid environment, this is what is to be expected. And the element here is that because it's not a glass terrarium and hence is plastic, the surface material and the condensation and the whole equilibrium, or to say kind of an ecology kind of set, it actually works best in this kind of environment. It may be very different when it comes to glass, because if it's too hot, everything get cooked inside and the whole thing starts to rot. So this is one of the plus points when you use a plastic terrarium material. I hope you enjoyed this particular video where I made an introduction from the beginning of the product right up to the end stage of making this particular terrarium. Do look out for my next video where I will be sharing more pointers and more tips and a little bit more introduction and deeper details on terrarium making and the suitable plants and sorts. So catch you again in the next video. Have a nice day. Take care. Bye.